So since being in the summer of 2012 Summer Institute, I have been researching potters and pottery made in Maysville, Kentucky, and have really thoroughly enjoyed finding this huge cache of thus far really understudied research. And like Mark Hewitt this morning, as a potter, I really geek out about pottery surfaces. And I usually talk about the Kentucky pieces through that and looking at firing techniques. But for today, I'm actually going to look at some of these new research things and also new evidence, and you're not going to hear as much about that. But if you really want to hear me geek out about stuff, come see the demos tomorrow. So there are certain stereotypes of what the backcountry in the South were and are. My particular favorite, you know, well-known reference, unfortunately, and the ever-enduring fringe. But stereotypes even existed in the 18th and 19th centuries about these places. However, we really do have to remember that the backcountry was not backward. And we're going to be focusing on this region here in the yellow in northern Kentucky, just east of Cincinnati. And though several of the potters I will talk about today are second generation Kentucky born, most of them came from points east, even as far as England. And it's telling that in the early 19th century, Lexington was referred to as the Athens of the West, and that in the 1820 Census of Manufacture, a potter working east of Maysville noted that his business was flourishing and in considerable demands for his article. Two earthenware potters are of note and are the earliest potters on the scene in Maysville, Kentucky. Rudolph Ricketts, who was originally from Maryland, is the earliest documented potter in Maysville to date. Thank goodness for the 1810 census in Maysville, which lists all of the trades of the people, not often seen. He also conveniently has several daughters who end up marrying most of the guys I'm going to talk about too, so that's always a fun part of research. But stoneware in Maysville can be told through this one piece of pottery over on the right. It was sold with the attribution of being made in the shop of James Miller in Alexandria, Virginia, but by comparing Miller's work to this jar, I don't feel that the attribution is very strong. And on the left, you see two pieces from Miller's work. But just to give you an idea of scale, it's really not that big, but the people who come together to manufacture it make this probably one of the finest keystones in Kentucky pottery manufacturing. I do find that the similarities between this piece and John Swan work more similar to that than of James Miller. John Swan, the two pieces seen on the left are John Swan's, was also from Alexandria, but there's something not quite close enough, and the clay body itself is dissimilar with the eagle jar. Then we'll add this in. This is a record showing the apprenticeship of one man named Thomas DeMint to John Swan, then a potter in the town of Alexandria. Add in this fantastic runaway ad for an earthenware potter in Cincinnati in 1817, who has one of my favorite descriptions. He is stout-made, down and surly look, light hair and eyes, speaks slow, and has a scar on the right side of his neck. Perhaps we should have been looking for a landlocked version of Ahab. He was originally from Maine, and his father was a sea captain, so you never know. But these two young potters arrive in Maysville in 1821 and in 1822, respectively. And then, lo and behold, in 1823, we have this. This is the first printed advertisement that I have found specifically for stoneware in the state of Kentucky, and you have both of these men, seen here at the bottom, Thomas DeMint and Joseph Claghorn Mendel, showing up on the advertisement. The eagle jar, as I fondly refer to it, and this is the backside of it up here, has more similarities to pieces from the Maysville region in shape, handle, and rim form, as well as clay body. And interestingly, the ownership of the piece also brings it back to Kentucky. It was pictured, as seen here on the screen, in the magazine Antiques in July of 1969, in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Brewer in northern Mercer County, Kentucky. The bill of sale from 2002 noted that the jar was found in Maysville by the mother of Mrs. Lawrence Brewer, which may place that original purchase in the second quarter of the 20th century. The question that has haunted me for a few years has been whether John Swan, the master potter who trained DeMint, also went west, as he disappears from the records in Alexandria after 1826 and has previously not been located. I feel moderately confident in sharing with you today to say that he ends up in Maysville, Kentucky, and first shows up in the 1826 tax list. While I have not completely worked it out just yet, but the fact is that John Swan may not have only been following his apprentice Thomas DeMint, but there's also a strong possibility that John Swan was actually joining family in the backcountry. That his earlier threats, as seen here in the newspaper, to move west were not because it sounded like a neat and fun adventure, but that he actually had family there, establishing business ties and roots as well, and sharing the news of good things going on in the West. And unlike the East Coast that was struggling financially, which you see these huge financial things going on by the late 18 teens, and certainly you see that toll being taken on John Swan in Alexandria in the early 1820s, the backcountry was booming, especially by the 1820s. And there were big things about to take place in Louisville, the expansion of a lock to move down the river. So I don't think John Swan wanted to miss out on that. And I feel confident to say that John Swan is in Maysville by 1830, and I'm working on the rest of the story. So you'll just have to stay in touch. An interesting side note that I would like to share is a connection between Maysville and Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1828, a man named Uzziah Kendall purchased a former pottery factory. Kendall, who was a longtime shoemaker of all things, also had a boarding house, and in 1829, as seen here in the Cincinnati Directory, had one Joseph Mendel, a potter, staying in his boarding house, and I'm sure that this is none other than Mr. Joseph Claghorn Mendel, who originally trained, as we saw, as a potter in Cincinnati. But then in 1831, Uzziah Kendall, the shoemaker, is transformed into being listed as a potter. And interestingly, Cincinnati is also where we see another one of Maysville's potters, Alfred Moss, who hails originally from outside of Norwalk, Connecticut, but shows up in Cincinnati in the late 1820s, conveniently before this development with Uzziah Kendall. And I also think it's funny to note that Jalef, he's seen here where he's boarding, is a shoemaker. So to have a former shoemaker, having somebody board with another shoemaker, also making pottery, I think there's a lot more going on in Cincinnati in just sort of a fun and geeky way. And I especially feel it's not a coincidence when you see the pots made in Cincinnati and compare them to those of being made in Maysville. So I really do feel confident that Joseph Claghorn Mendel, as well as Alfred Moss, probably were instrumental in the beginning of the stoneware industry in Cincinnati. So much of the previous scholarship on Maysville largely focused on the pottery of Isaac Thomas. However, as you can get a glimpse through my talk today, he's only one of numerous potters working on the banks of the Ohio River. And most of the research also notes that he did not begin his pottery until the early 1830s. However, Isaac Thomas is one of those second-generation born Kentucky potters, and he's working with Rudolph Ricketts as early as the 1806 and early 1800s. So I think he actually has a career much earlier than we give him credit for. Another group of potters working in Maysville is the Wood family. And I say Wood family because the piece is marked with J&E Wood, and you can kind of make it out. You can go and visit this lovely creature over in the MESDA gallery. But up here on the top, you see J&E Wood often stamped on these pieces. They're typically associated with brothers John and Ezekiel Wood, but in the 1850 Census of Manufacture, their father, Jesse Wood, is also noted as a potter. And this piece in the center of the screen has Joseph Wood, who's also listed in 1850 census as a potter, painted in slip across the shoulder. The Wood family came down from eastern Pennsylvania originally, but the father and the sons, so this is almost like a second and third generation Kentucky-born potters. Alexander Allen, and you can sort of see up here, Alexander Charles Allen, A.C. Allen, was another potter working in Maysville by the 1840s. He's likely originally from New York City, which is really fascinating, and possibly the son of another potter named Alexander Allen, who was working in New York City between 1811 and 1812, and in the 1820 census as well. There's also an Englishman named John Cobb, you see here J. Cobb, who's from England. And he shows up in Brown County, Ohio, just across the river in the late 1820s, and then starts working in Maysville in the 1830s and listed as a potter there in the 1850s. And this piece certainly deserves a note, as it recently came on the market with the attribution of being made by Ezekiel Henry Wood, attribution through the initials and the last name. But the research on this piece is yet young, so you'll just have to also stay tuned for that piece. Who else is here? Enslaved potters were working in Maysville as both Isaac Thomas, the Ricketts, and the Wood family all owned slaves. And the large communities of free people of color that began forming in northern Kentucky by the second quarter of the 19th century beg further research as to whether or not there were any free potters of color also working. And I look forward to expanding on this topic at a presentation next February and working and talking a little bit more to Angelica. As with the many communities of clay, there is seldom one main potter working or only one factory. And Maysville has quickly become, for me, a very fascinating network of potters and trade. And certainly their trade was their focus. Via steamboats and flatboats, the potters in northern Kentucky quickly captured a willing market and expanded downriver. And this is not from Kentucky, unfortunately, but I love this image of a steamboat with pots lined up on the riverbank, and then how some Pennsylvania potters used to use flatboats shipping things down the way. And this whole network all the way down to New Orleans from Kentucky was their direct route, especially once Louisville figured out that minor detail of shifting an entire river around the city. And it's really incredible to think about moving the stoneware pottery, much less marketing the pots downriver, and also how potters such as Isaac Thomas were able to connect with merchants down the river and make pots. For merchants such as these pieces here, made for merchants in Louisiana and Mississippi. My favorite piece is this piece here in the center. This was excavated in New Orleans in the Merchants District and was made for a merchant named John C. Morris. It's interestingly also a form that we've never seen intact, straight sides with this beautiful rim here at the top. And it's rather large. I can't remember its exact size, but it's a pretty big piece. And so that's really interesting to combine archaeology. And I do wish I could say we have archaeological evidence for the kilns in Kentucky, but unfortunately, unlike a lot of the other places we've sort of mentioned this morning, we don't really have that in Kentucky. So that's one of my heartbreaking things for Kentucky research. But maybe someday. So everything going on in Maysville really comes together for a great story about commerce, trade, money, and marriage. If only there could have been television in the 1820s, and maybe we'd be learning about something other than duck calls. But I hope you may take away an appreciation for a humble clay and broaden your perceptions as to how connected potters were, how connected they were, and then their layered stories of Eastern connections and Southern roots. And, as a closing teaser, what does the French Revolution, a Frenchman, and Abraham Lincoln have to do with possibly earlier foundations of stoneware in Kentucky, as well as the manufacture of queensware? Y'all just have to stay tuned for that. So, thank you very much.